G'day, I'm Patrick from Douglas Fur Design. Welcome to the Router Bits. Have a look at these Torquata slot cutters. They come in a whole bunch of different sizes, in a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch shank. Honestly, I think there's like 25 or more different sizes. And all of those sizes just relate to how thick the actual blade is. So they go from about 2 mil to about 6.5 mil. And if you need a larger slot, you can actually stack them on top of one another. The depth of the cut from the bearing to the tip of the blade is always 12.7 or a 1/2 inch. But you can actually get different size bearings if you have a really specific job in mind. Otherwise, if you're using it in a router table, you can just bring the fence past the bearing to get a shallower cut. And I can run you through that in a second. Alrighty, so you can buy these slot cutters individually. If you need a specific size, you just go and pick up a 2 mil slot cutter with a 1/4 inch shank, and that's all you need. But they also come in a stacked set, and so these only come with a 1/2 inch shank, but they give you 4 different thicknesses of slot cutter blades, which you can remove, stack in different combinations to get an exact thickness that might suit you. You can also buy any of the other slot cutter sizes to stack onto there to get a really specific size. Say if you needed to stack, 2 mils, it was the only way to get 6 mil, for instance. And that's a really simple way to go. That being said, some of the individual slot cutters, if you have a look at them, they do have additional thread on top, and so you can buy another slot cutting blade and stack it on top of this one rather than buying a full set. But you just need to keep in mind that some of the smaller ones just don't have the additional thread needed to stack another cutter in there. So the slot cutter is a pretty straightforward router bit compared to some of the more complicated ones we've looked at. But they're really versatile. You can use them for tons of things. Some of the more common uses would be using them in a similar way to a biscuit cutter. So cutting a slot the exact size of those standard lamello biscuits. I think it's a number 2 size. And then you can place biscuits anywhere along on the edge of 2 pieces that you want to laminate together, instead of having a specific spot where you've cut a biscuit hole. Or if you don't have a biscuit jointer, if you don't have a biscuit cutting machine specifically, it allows you to use your router table to do that really simply. There are also plenty of times when I've used it to insert a piece of ply or a piece of glass into a timber frame. And I'm actually going to make up a really simple glass timber frame that might be used to do a display box, or similar to sort of a picture frame type idea, where the glass is actually captured inside the frame, and we'll glue it all together that way. So I'll be using one size of slot cutter to do a job similar to a biscuit, but I'm just going to use a piece of MDF as the biscuit because that's what I've got lying around today. And then I'm also going to cut a slot for a 6 mil piece of glass, and then we'll glue the whole thing together, and it should be pretty quick and simple. I've decided to do a little really simple project, which is going to be a square frame with an extra side that I can't hold up because I've only got 2 hands, with a glass insert. And the reason I'm making this, I've had to do this before to build some display cabinets for a jewellery store, and in their case the framing material was even thinner and I had a huge chunk of glass, so it was really important that these joints were super strong. So one way you can do that, because inherently miter joints aren't particularly strong, is you need to put a spline or a biscuit in there. I do have a biscuit cutting machine and I do use biscuits quite frequently, but there's also a way you can do it with a slot cutter on your router table, and that means you don't have to use an actual biscuit. You can use whatever material suits the thickness of the slot cutter that you have. Now, I've got some 3.2 mil MDF lying around. That'll do for this little demonstration. So I've actually grabbed a 3.2 mil slot cutting blade, and it's going to cut a slot a depth of 12.7 or 1/2 inch deep into the material. So all I've got to do is set that at the height that I want, so it's sitting pretty much central within my piece here, and then make sure that I put stops so I'm not going outside the end because I don't want to see that slot. So I'll do all of those ends first, and then I'll organise a different size slot cutter to cut my slot all the way around the insides of these pieces so that my piece of glass fits in there really nice and snugly. First thing I want to do with my 3.2 mil slot cutter is to lock it into the machine. Standard practice, really. Alright, so the next thing I want to do is actually set the height of my slot cutter. Now in this case we're just cutting a slot for essentially a biscuit, so it's kind of arbitrary. I just want to put it in the middle. This is 19mm stock, that's 3mm thick, so if I have a space of about 8mm beneath this slot, that'll kind of be roughly even. I've got an 8mm piece of ply here, so that'll do as a spacer. This is just kind of a quick lazy way to do it when it doesn't need to be exact. I can just drop that down so it meets up with that piece of ply. So for a standard cut with a slot cutter, if you're going on a fairly long piece of grain on the edge or the face, you could just use the standard fence. You'd make sure that those fences were outside of where those slots, the blades are obviously. Because I'm trying to put a slot in the end here and there's not a lot of length, I'm actually going to use some sacrificial fences on top of these ones to just narrow that gap, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that now. I've just got some scrap. I'm actually going to clamp them onto my fence, making sure that they are the distance of the bearing apart, so that the bearing, the bit that can't cut timber, is actually going to fit between them. Alright, so I've very quickly clamped the fence, and what I'm going to do now is actually really slowly, while the router is on, push these back until those slot cutting blades have cut 2 slots right of the way through, and from there I'll set the depth of my fence to the bearing. So now that I've got these fences on and they've cut through nice little slots, I'm just going to line the fence up with the bearing and lock that off. Perfect, so we're ready to go. So the last thing that I'm going to do is actually just draw some lines on my sacrificial fences here that show exactly how far these blades go. Because when I'm passing my timber over there, the blade is going to be inside the timber. I'm not going to be able to see it. So I'm just going to put this piece of timber up against the blade, and it's square, so I can just run a line there so I know exactly where that blade end is going to be. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And that just means as I'm running this along, I don't want the blades to come out on the outside of this frame, because you'll be able to see that trench, and I don't want to. I want it to stay within the corners. You could set this up using stops, but I'm just going to do it visually. I don't think it'll be terribly challenging, so famous last words. We'll see how we go. Alright, make sure you've marked the top face of each piece so that the distance from the bottom is the same on every single one, and we're just going to start passing these through now. Some of them will be coming from, we're always going to be going against the direction of the router, but some are going to be going point side first, which means we need to actually plunge it in, and some of them we're going to be passing through the inside, which means we can drag them over and then pull out before we exit on our good side. Alright, now that all my biscuit slots are cut, I'm actually going to cut the slot for the glass to sit in. The glass is 6mm, so I'm going to use a 6mm slot cutter. And the setup is going to be exactly the same as before. I'm going to pull the fence back, change over that slot cutter, pull the fence back through to enlarge my slots in my sacrificial fence to 6mm instead of the 3.2 that they are now. And then I'm going to be passing each of these pieces just along this inside face. I don't need to touch, in fact I don't want to touch these slots. They need to remain intact for our biscuits, and then we'll just be putting a 6mm slot all the way along this face. I'm going to set the depth at the bottom of that 6mm cut at 8mm as well, so it actually sits on the bottom of this cut, and you'll see that once I'm done it'll all line up really neatly. Alright, so I ran these through, worked perfectly. I just made 2 slight changes. I didn't end up needing those sacrificial fences on here because I was running along a long edge, so there was no chance of it falling into this gap here. And I also didn't quite get the 8mm underneath the cutter just because of the specific size of this cutter. I could have taken it out and raised it up a little bit in the chuck, but I just didn't need to. So now we can cut some biscuit material using our MDF to go into those slots, and then once that's all set we can glue it all together with the glass inside and we'll be done. So I've laid these little frames out how they're going to be arranged and joined. I'm just going to lay my piece of glass on top just so I have an idea of where I can place my little MDF biscuits. So where that glass ends is actually where the slots that we cut along this edge also ended, which is about, it's a little bit less than that actually, but we want to make sure that our MDF biscuits don't interfere with that glass. So we can take that off. We know that the slots that we cut for our MDF biscuits are about 1.5 deep. Yep, about that. So we can just mark that on here and draw that parallel to that edge as well, more or less. Same thing on the other side. And then we also know, because we cut this with a round slot cutter, this end of this slot is actually curved like that. So there's no point cutting a square MDF biscuit because it's not going to get all the way into this corner. So we'll just make it a bit shorter. We'll just cut it off about there. And I've had a quick measure of all these, and we can make it about 30mm wide by a little bit under 30mm long, so pretty much just a little square. And so I'll cut 4 of them. We'll test fit them to make sure that they all work pretty snugly, and then we'll go from there into gluing. So I'm ready to glue this frame up. I've lined them all up on my table, made sure all the faces are the ones I intend to be facing upwards, which they are. And I'm just going to run some masking tape along the back edge of these miters, and I'll use that to help me clamp it all together. So there are actually tons of ways to glue up a mitered frame like this. Masking tape works pretty well for me. There are some really nifty techniques though, using some proper frame clamps, so you can look into them. I'm pretty sure Tim & Carlton has a variety of them. Once I've put the tape on, I just flip it forward like that, and then I'll put glue in all of these surfaces, making sure I don't want to get too much in where the glass is going to go. I'll put glue on my little MDF biscuits. I'll fold this all together, putting the glass into the frame, and then tape up that final joint, and that'll keep the pressure on it till the glue dries. I recently transitioned from the old tomato sauce bottle to one of these glue bots. Super simple mechanism, means you can actually push glue out even with the bottle upright or at any angle, and it works really well. It makes my life a little bit easier when I'm gluing big pieces up, which is often the most stressful part of my job. This makes things just go a little bit more quickly, so pretty handy little device. So you can pick up those slot cutting bits and the slot cutting sets from Timbecon. They're made by Torcata. Fantastic, really easy to use, and you can grab them on the Timbecon website at timbecon.com.au or in either of their stores in Perth and in Melbourne.